Now, the next one also, let's see whether we would actually have picked up that or not, depending on what the question statements were like. So, what is the question statement? Based on the information provided in the passage, all of the following are true except. So, I don't know anything about the topic there. The author sees the rise of Netflix in Europe. Okay, so that means Netflix is becoming popular in Europe. So, there's something about that. Then it says, based only on the information provided in the passage, which one of the following hypothetical Netflix shows would be most successful? So, we talk about Netflix becoming popular in Europe for certain reasons. Fine. Which one of the following research findings would weaken the author's conclusion in the final paragraph? I can't tell the topic from that, but I do know from two questions here that we're going to be discussing Netflix, the fact that Netflix is becoming popular in Europe, and obviously a discussion of reasons also, because the person says which one of the following would be most successful. So, Netflix, its popularity in Europe, and the reasons thereof. Now, that should be easy enough considering the fact that Netflix is something that we all watch all the time, and therefore we'd be interested in knowing what this person says. So, I would not actually put this down to later on. It is something that all of us who actually watch, let's say, programs on the internet would actually be in some sense familiar with. So, let's deal with it. There's likely to be something familiar over here. So, let's see. So, Umberto Eco, an Italian writer, was right when he said the language of Europe is translation. Netflix and other deep-pocketed global firms. What do you mean by deep-pocketed? People who have actually gathered a fair amount of money, right? So, they've been very profitable, they have lots of reserves, and therefore they have deep pockets. So, Netflix and other deep-pocketed global firms speak it as well. Why is that? Because they actually look at lots of translation. Just as the EU employs a small army of translators and interpreters to turn intricate laws or impassioned speeches of Romanian MEPs, that or it should be MPs rather, into the EU's 24 official languages. So, just like the EU actually uses translators because they have multiple languages in the EU, so do the likes of Netflix. Even Netflix uses translation. It now offers dubbing in 34 languages and subtitling in a few more, which means because it's presenting things to the European audience, it actually has 34 languages, dubbing and subtitling. Okay. The economics of European productions are more appealing too. Here, again, we're looking at, let's say, stuff that's to be shown to the audiences, right? Economics are more appealing, which means it's probably easier to produce in Europe. Easier as in slightly financially advantageous, right? So, the economics of European productions are more appealing too. American audiences are more willing than before to give dubbed or subtitling views a chance. That means they're actually willing to listen to stuff that is dubbed or subtitled, which means the production was originally in some European language, but American audiences are willing to give it a try because of the fact that it's been dubbed or subtitled. This means shows such as Lupin, a French crime caper on Netflix, can become global hits, which means something that was made for France can actually be a global hit because it's subtitled or dubbed, thanks to translation. Now you understand what they're saying, that you can take all the productions, so you get the sense here. You can take all these European productions also, which happen in languages other than English, and make them available to the English, let's say the English speaking or the English, the audiences who desire content in English, thanks to translation. So, such things like French, let's say, productions can become global hits. In 2015, about 75% of Netflix original content was American. In 2015, that's 10 years ago. Now the figure is half. Now 50% is American, the other 50 is what? Is all from other countries, and how are people watching them? Because they are dubbed or subtitled. So now the figure is half according to Ampere, a media analysis company. Netflix has about 100 productions underway in Europe, which is more than big public broadcasters in France or Germany, which means Netflix themselves has the largest production content in Europe, getting things produced in Europe, which would eventually find audiences in Europe, but would also find audiences elsewhere thanks to the fact that it will be translated or subtitled. So, not everything works across borders. So, not everything can actually work in translation. Comedy sometimes struggles, and you know why? Because comedy is typically a very community-based, society-based, tradition-based kind of area. So, people who don't understand cultures or traditions might not understand comedy. So, comedy sometimes struggles. Whodunits and bloodthirsty maelstroms between arch Romans and uppity tribesmen have a more universal appeal, which means Crime, because that is not dependent on, or crime stories, because that's not dependent on, let us say, culture and tradition. And even all this medieval kind of, let's say, battles between those who are trying to civilize and the tribesmen they were trying to civilize. This is all historical background that nobody really needs tradition for. So things that don't need tradition, like whodunits, which is crime stories, and bloodthirsty maelstorms, which is the violence of or violence depictions of, or depictions of the violence of medieval times, have a more universal appeal. Some do it better than others, right? Barbarians aside, some do it better than others, barbarians aside. That means it's not just tribes persons and the barbarians against the Romans, but there could be other, let's say, battle based kind of things that are actually also quite effective. So German television is not always built for export, says one executive, being polite. In other words, what this person is saying is German programs don't quite translate very easily. That's what he's being polite. In other words, he's saying German stuff can't really be translated easily. A bigger problem is that national broadcasters still dominate, which means in each country, national broadcasters still hold the production, let's say, or the distribution rights of something. Streaming services such as Netflix or Disney account for about a third of all viewing hours. That means national broadcasters still take 2/3 of the space, even in markets where they are well established. Europe is an aging continent. The generation of teens staring at phones is outnumbered by elders who prefer to go up at the box, which means, thanks to the fact that there are more old people in Europe than young ones, the older ones would prefer to watch stuff made for them, by their people, in their languages. That's in Europe. In Brussels and national capitals, the prospect of Netflix as a cultural hegemon, that means dominant, is seen as a threat. In Brussels and national capitals, that means in areas which are cosmopolitan, which actually have young population as well, there Netflix could possibly be dominant. Cultural sovereignty is the watchword of European executives worried that the Americans will eat their lunch. That means they would like to be, in some sense, distinct in their cultural recognition so that Americans don't actually dominate over them. And we are not talking about politically here, no? We are talking about production of, let us say, feature films and series and stuff provided over the tube. To be fair, Netflix content sometimes seems stuck in an uncanny valley somewhere in the mid-Atlantic. That means, should we be catering to the Americans? Should we be catering to the Europeans? With local quirks stripped out, and you take away the things that might actually irritate either side, and you stay in a very safe zone where both could actually look at. Netflix originals, that means the programs that Netflix produces themselves, tend to have fewer specific cultural references than shows produced by domestic rivals. So now you understand why the person says, or this is clearly what the person said in the previous line, they are stuck in a valley, uncanny valley, right? That means a very something that you would not have expected, but that's what they do. Somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, which means they are halfway between the Americans and the Europeans in that sense. That means they produce things that would appeal to both the Americans and the Europeans. Why? Because they don't put in specific cultural references, whereas local, let us say, production houses in Europe probably do. So that means local production houses would appeal to the Europeans, but not so much to the Americans, right? But Netflix originals then try to take away all the stripped of the, let us say, as it's actually said, no, with local quirks stripped out, stripped of the local culture so that it actually appeals to everybody. So the company used to have, so this is according to this Enders, a market analyst, the company used to have an imperial model of commissioning, which means everything done from the headquarters, with executives in Los Angeles cooking up ideas French people might like. So they would decide what they're going to present to the French. But now Netflix has offices across Europe so that they can actually gather what it is that they need and produce it right there. But ultimately, the big decisions rest with American executives. This makes European politicians nervous. Why politicians? Because American executives start to use, let us say, Netflix productions to gain popularity and thereby, in some sense, induce American domination, American ideas into Europe, then European politicians would actually be nervous, especially now, because they are not very happy with the Americans as such. So you get that. So in other words, it's only in the end that we are talking about the possible political impact of, let's say, television programs on people, and that is why European politicians are a little, let us say, concerned about the fact that Americans might still be able to influence European thinking. Okay. So, they shouldn't be. They should not be nervous. Why is that? Because Europeans are going to prefer their cultures in that sense. An irony of the European integration is that it is often American companies that facilitate it. It's Americans who make possible the fact that European culture can actually be taken across the waters into America. Google Translate makes European newspapers comprehensible, even if a little clunky, for the continent's non-polyglots. That means Google Translate makes Europeans newspapers something that everyone can understand in English, even though it might not be very clear or might seem a little clumsy, for the continent's non-polyglots, for people in the continent who don't have the other languages. So you have, let us say, an Italian who does not speak anything except Italian, but then thanks to Translate, he can read Norwegian news, he can read, let us say, Danish news, he can read Slovenian news. That's it. So the point is, Google Translate makes it possible for everyone, even the non-polyglots, even people who don't know multiple languages, to understand the rest of what Europe is talking about. American social media companies make it easier for Europeans to talk politics across borders. So because you have WhatsApp and X and so on, people are actually able to communicate irrespective of which language they speak. So that means Europe shouldn't worry about it, because Europe is actually in some sense being provided with tools by the Americans that enable Europe to consider itself as an entity. So they do not always like to hear what they say about each other, but that's another matter, which means, people might communicate across borders, they might dispute, but the fact is they are communicating. Now, Netflix and friends, that means people like them, pump the same content into homes across a continent, making culture across border endeavor too. So just like thought and politics can actually be done across borders in Europe, now even culture can actually be understood thanks to Netflix. So that means European politicians don't need to worry about the fact that the Americans are coming back to invade Europe, because the Americans are providing tools where the Europeans can actually start to be cohesive by themselves. So if Europeans are to share a currency, bail each other out in times of financial need, and share vaccines and pandemic, then they need to have something else in common also, even if it is just binging on the same series. So it means this whole business of their watching the same programs, because of, let's say, translation and subtitling, makes it possible for them to believe that they actually belong together. So watching fictitious northern and southern Europeans tear each other apart 2000 years ago beats doing so in reality, which means when you watch programs about Europeans who fought each other, then you don't need to have to do it now, basically. So that's what the person says. European politicians don't need to worry. American tools are being used by Europeans, especially in their social, let's say, interactions, as well in their entertainment, to actually, in some sense, form a body, a cohesive body themselves. Fine. So that's the idea here. Again, not a difficult passage, because it was so related to something that we already are familiar with that it was not too difficult to pick up the flow. So what do we have? Based on information provided in the passage, all of the following are true, except, that means there are three things that can be understood from the passage, but one is not. Only half of Netflix original program the EU is now produced in America. Only half of their program is produced in America. Yes, we are told that. He says earlier it was 75%, now it's only half. So this is true. Yes, we've got that. Then Netflix has been able to transform itself to a truly European entity? Not really, because he says that while Netflix is producing stuff in Europe, producing stuff for Europe, the decisions are still being taken by Americans. So it's not a truly European entity. So we know that is possibly not what the passage is telling us. What about 3? European television productions have the potential to become global hits thanks to the fact that subtitling and let us say translate and dubbing happens, very much like Lupin, the French crime series, became a global hit. So they have the potential to become, that is also true. National broadcasters dominate in the EU in terms of total television viewing hours. Quite right. It tells us that Netflix occupies about 1/3 of eyeball space, whereas national programs, local programs broadcast nationally or by national broadcasters still occupy 2/3 of the space. So we know that 1, 3 and 4 we can pick up from the passage, but not 2, because it has not become a truly European entity. It's still directed by executives in America. Fine. So 2 then is your answer to 5. What about 6? The author sees the rise of Netflix in Europe as what? As something that is going to bring Europe together. He says that thanks to all of this, Europe is actually going to become more cohesive because they'll understand each other, they'll understand each other's cultures, and while they might love to watch how historically they fought each other, they're not likely to do that now. So is it an economic threat? No. A unifying force? Yeah. And just filling an entertainment gap? No. He doesn't say there was a gap to be filled. He says that the entertainment provided allows people to understand each other. A looming cultural threat? No. It actually is not a cultural threat. It is actually a way of getting to understand other people's cultures, basically. So he sees the rise of Netflix as something that's actually going to bring Europeans together in some sense, with tools that the Americans actually provide them with. So 6, the answer is 2. What about 7? Based only on information provided in the passage. So that means even the person who made this question is being very careful and saying, don't go by what you know since you are all movie watchers. Based only on information provided in the passage, which one of the following hypothetical Netflix shows would be most successful with audiences across the EU? And we know that the show would be one that helps them understand other cultures, right? But is related to European culture. Okay, European culture which Europeans can understand across areas. So that would be a really successful show. So an Italian comedy show hosted by international star? Not necessarily. A murder mystery drama set in North Africa and France? Right, because the person says whodunits have absolute appeal. That means crime stories have absolute appeal because there is no cultural component there that they need to actually try to understand. It's just that everything is actually something that's common to all of them. So it's a very common kind of thought process that is easy to depict and will therefore be very successful. It actually says, no, whodunits and all these shows of medieval battles are really very important, very popular. So yeah, a murder mystery drama set in North Africa and France would not just be across the EU, it will be popular elsewhere in the world also thanks to translation, we know that. A transatlantic romantic drama set in Europe and America, but romance usually has a cultural component to it. So that might not be as successful as a murder mystery, we know that. And then an original German TV science fiction production, but people very clearly say German programs are difficult to translate because they're very culturally, specific. So they're difficult to translate for other people. I mean, they don't actually relate very easily to other people. So 2 then would actually be the answer to 7. Okay. And now if we come down to the last one, which one of the following research findings would weaken the author's conclusion in the final paragraph? Now, what was his conclusion? His final conclusion was that don't worry too much about the fact that they're watching stuff presented by an American company. It's not going to alter their thinking, it's not going to make them Americans, because with American tools, they just get to understand each other better and they get to be a slightly more unified kind of body. Which one? The Europeans. So what is it then? What would weaken that? So that means 3 statements there, or 1 statement there is going to tell you that's not going to be the case. It's not always going to be true. That means it could end up in some sense leading to American domination, or it's not necessarily going to lead to European unity, one of those. So research shows that Netflix has been gradually losing market share to other streaming television service providers. That's not weakening the author's conclusion, because he's already told you that they are not the dominant, let us say, distribution house in Europe, right? Those are the local television service providers. But other streaming television service providers have not been discussed. We've not actually talked about Netflix vis-a-vis, let's say, Amazon Prime or anything else. So that discussion is not there, so we're not looking at one. Research shows that Netflix has hits produced in France are very popular with North American audiences, but that doesn't weaken his conclusion, because his conclusion is that Netflix is actually in some sense bringing Europe together. So research shows that there's a wide variance in the popularity and viewing of Netflix shows across very different EU countries. Now that would weaken the finding, because the finding was in the last paragraph, because we're looking at the final paragraph, right? And the final paragraph talked about the fact that Netflix is going to unify Europe. And here's something that says it's not going to. It says there's a wide variance in the popularity. That means some places popular, some places not popular. So you can't really say it's going to unify Europe. So 3 is possible there. What about 4? Research shows that older women across the EU enjoy